the scent of espresso mingled with leather and old paper, a combination that had become as familiar to me as my own perfume over the past 5 years. I stood in Alessandro Moretti's private office, reviewing the month's financial projections on my tablet, while he sat behind his mahogany desk, signing documents with the same methodical precision he applied to everything in his life. My fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, cross-referencing numbers that most people would need hours to verify. I caught discrepancies within seconds, a skill that had made me indispensable to a man who tolerated nothing less than perfection. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting geometric shadows across the Persian rug beneath my feet. The shipment from Genoa arrived on schedule, I reported, my voice measured and professional. Customs clearance went through without complications. The warehouse inventory matches the manifest exactly. No shrinkage, no discrepancies. Alessandro looked up from the contract he was reviewing, his dark eyes meeting mine briefly, before returning to the document. At 44, he carried himself with the kind of authority that didn't require raised voices or dramatic gestures. His power lay in stillness, in the way silence could stretch until lesser men broke under the weight of it. "And the meeting with the Calabresi family?" he asked, his accent softening certain consonants in a way that reminded me he'd been born in Sicily, even though he'd built his empire here. "Confirmed for Thursday evening, 7 o'clock at Osteria Luna, private dining room reserved under the usual arrangements." I scrolled through my notes. Security detail coordinated with Marco. 3 perimeter positions, 2 inside the restaurant. Background checks completed on all Calabresi attendees. No concerning associations flagged. He nodded once, a gesture that conveyed both approval and dismissal of the topic. This was our rhythm, established over thousands of similar exchanges. I anticipated his needs before he voiced them, solved problems before they became complications, maintained order in a world that constantly threatened chaos. My role extended far beyond what any job description could capture. I managed legitimate businesses that served as the public face of his operations, coordinated with lawyers when legal issues arose, ensured that nothing in the shadow empire he commanded left traces that could be exploited. I knew which judges could be influenced, which politicians owed favors, which rivals posed genuine threats versus those who merely postured. The knowledge should have terrified me. Perhaps it had in the beginning, when I was 25, and desperate enough to accept a position that paid 3 times what my journalism degree had been worth. But fear had gradually transformed into something more complex, a understanding that Alessandro Moretti operated by codes that, while outside legal boundaries, held their own internal logic and honor. He didn't harm innocents. He kept his word, even when breaking it would have been advantageous. He protected those under his umbrella with absolute commitment. These weren't justifications, merely observations I'd collected over 5 years of working closer to him than anyone else in his organization. "The Brennan situation," Alessandro said, setting down his fountain pen with deliberate care. "What's your assessment?" I'd been expecting this question. Patrick Brennan, a mid-level associate who handled distribution logistics, had been skimming product for the past 3 months. The evidence was conclusive, documented in spreadsheets I'd compiled with the same attention to detail I applied to everything. "He's stealing," I stated simply. Approximately $40,000 worth of merchandise diverted to personal sales channels. The pattern started 12 weeks ago, escalated gradually. He's been careful, but not careful enough. Alessandro's expression didn't change, but I'd learned to read the subtle tightening around his eyes, the way his fingers stilled on the desk's edge. Anger, but controlled, channeled into calculation rather than explosion. "Recommended action?" he asked. This was the test he posed periodically, gauging whether I understood not just the mechanics of his business, but the philosophy underlying it. A wrong answer would reveal gaps in my comprehension of the delicate balance he maintained between reputation and pragmatism. "Brennan has a wife, 2 young children," I began, organizing my thoughts with the same structure I used for financial reports. No prior incidents and 4 years of employment. The timing coincides with his daughter's diagnosis, medical bills that his insurance doesn't fully cover. I paused, meeting Alessandro's gaze directly. He made a choice that betrayed your trust, which can't be overlooked. But the circumstances suggest desperation, rather than greed or disloyalty to your organization itself. Your recommendation? Alessandro pressed, his tone giving nothing away. Terminate his employment immediately, I said clearly. Make an example that reinforces consequences for theft, but allow him to keep what he's already taken as severance. Ensure he understands that disappearing from this city and this life is non-negotiable, and that any future transgression would be met with less mercy. Alessandro considered this for a long moment, his fingers drumming once against the desk's surface. Then he nodded. Arrange it. Have Marco deliver the message tonight. Relief flickered through me, quickly suppressed. I'd grown too comfortable in these moral gray areas, parsing lesser evils and justifying decisions that existed outside the framework I'd been raised to respect. But I'd also witnessed enough of Alessandro's world to know that my suggested approach was genuinely merciful compared to alternatives other men in his position would have chosen. The Peterson audit is scheduled for next week, I continued, shifting topics with practiced ease. I'll need to pull the corresponding documentation from the archive, verify that all transactions appear legitimate under scrutiny. Take Marcus with you, Alessandro said. The archive is in the industrial district. I don't want you going alone after dark. It was a small thing, this casual concern for my safety, but characteristic of how he treated me. Not quite as an employee, despite the professional boundaries we maintained, but as something more valuable, someone whose loss would constitute more than inconvenience. My phone buzzed softly against my hip, a text notification I ignored. Alessandro noticed, his attention sharpening in that way that missed nothing. Something urgent? He asked. Personal matter, I replied smoothly. Nothing that requires immediate attention. It was true enough. David, a colleague from my previous life in journalism, had been persistently suggesting dinner for the past 2 weeks. I'd been deflecting with vague promises of checking my schedule, but his latest message pressed for a definite answer. Alessandro returned to his documents, apparently satisfied. I made notes on my tablet about the Brennan situation, drafted the preliminary schedule for next week's audit preparation, confirmed tomorrow's appointments with his attorney and accountant. The work consumed another hour, our conversation reduced to efficient exchanges of information and decision points. This was normal, the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned to communicate in shorthand, who understood each other's patterns well enough that extensive explanation was rarely necessary. At 6:30, I began gathering my materials, preparing for the transition from office to evening that marked the boundary between my professional existence and whatever personal life I'd managed to maintain in the margins. One more thing, Alessandro said as I reached for my bag. The Santoro wedding next month, I'll need you there. I paused, confused. For security coordination? As my date. The words landed between us with unexpected weight. In 5 years, Alessandro had never asked me to accompany him to social functions beyond strictly business meetings, where my presence served strategic purposes. I don't understand, I said carefully. Appearances matter in these situations, he explained, his tone remaining neutral. Arriving alone suggests vulnerability or lack of status. You're intelligent, educated, capable of navigating complex social dynamics. You'll represent me well. It was logical, purely transactional. Yet something in the request felt different, a subtle shift in the foundation we'd built our professional relationship upon. Of course, I agreed, because refusing would have required explanations I couldn't articulate. I'll add it to the calendar. My phone buzzed again, David's persistence refusing to be ignored. I glanced at the screen, reading his message. Dinner Friday? There's a new place in the North End I think you'd love. Say yes this time?" Alessandro noticed my attention on the phone, his expression unreadable. I typed a quick response, accepting the invitation before I could overthink it. I needed something outside this office, outside the gravitational pull of Alessandro Moretti's world, a reminder that I existed as more than the perfect assistant who anticipated his every need. "Good night, Mr. Moretti," I said, using the formal address we maintained during business hours, despite the informality that occasionally crept into our interactions. "Helena," he replied, my name carrying something I couldn't quite identify. "Have a pleasant evening." I left his office, walking through the reception area where Carla, the night receptionist, was settling in for her shift. The elevator descended smoothly, carrying me away from the penthouse suite that served as Alessandro's operational headquarters, away from the world of carefully managed violence and strategic calculation. The autumn air outside hit my face with sharp clarity, a physical reminder of the transition between spaces. I walked 3 blocks to where I'd parked, my heels clicking against concrete with rhythmic precision that matched my heartbeat. My apartment was small but meticulously organized, every surface clear, every item in its designated place. I'd learned organization from necessity, from managing Alessandro's complex empire, and the habits had bled into my personal space. I changed into comfortable clothes, poured a glass of wine, and settled onto my couch with a book I'd been meaning to read for months. But my mind kept drifting back to Alessandro's expression when I'd checked my phone, to the slight tension in his posture that I'd learned to recognize as displeasure. I told myself I was imagining things, projecting meaning onto neutral moments because I'd spent so long interpreting his micro-expressions as part of my job. The wine tasted bitter on my tongue. I set it aside, unopened book resting forgotten on my lap, and stared at the city lights visible through my window. Somewhere in that sprawling darkness, Alessandro was likely still working, still managing the empire that never truly slept, still maintaining the careful balance that kept his world functioning. I wondered, not for the first time, what it cost him to carry that weight alone. And I wondered why, after 5 years of professional distance, the question had started to matter to me in ways that had nothing to do with my job. Friday arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made Manhattan feel almost civilized. I dressed carefully for work, choosing a tailored navy suit that projected competence without severity, paired with heels that added 3 inches to my height without sacrificing the ability to move quickly when necessary. The morning passed in its usual rhythm of coordinated chaos. I fielded calls from 3 different attorneys, rescheduled a meeting that conflicted with Alessandro's preferred lunch window, and resolved a shipment delay that could have cascaded into genuine complications if left unaddressed. Alessandro moved through the day with his characteristic controlled energy, his focus absolute during the 2-hour strategy session with his senior associates. I sat to his right, taking notes and occasionally interjecting clarifications when asked, my presence so integrated into these meetings that the men barely acknowledged it anymore. It was shortly after 3 when everything shifted. I was standing near Alessandro's desk, reviewing the latest financial reports on my tablet, when my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and I glanced at Alessandro before answering, a courtesy I extended from years of conditioning to ensure I wasn't interrupting something critical. He nodded slightly, continuing his review of the contract in front of him. "Hi, David," I answered, keeping my voice professional despite the personal nature of the call. "Helena, I know this is last minute, but I managed to get us a reservation at Maria for tonight instead," David said enthusiastically. 7:30. I hope that still works for you? I felt Alessandro's attention shift, though he didn't look up from the documents. The quality of his stillness changed, became more focused, like a predator sensing movement in its peripheral vision. "That sounds wonderful," I replied, genuinely pleased. Maria was notoriously difficult to book, and I appreciated David's effort. 7:30 works perfectly. "Great, I'll pick you up at 7, David continued. "I'm really looking forward to this, Helena, it's been too long since we caught up properly. We exchanged a few more pleasantries before ending the call. I set my phone down and returned my attention to the financial reports, noting a discrepancy in the shipping costs that would need investigation. "You have plans tonight," Alessandro said quietly. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Dinner with an old colleague, David Rosen. We worked together at the Tribune before I came here." Alessandro's pen stopped moving across the page. He looked up then, his dark eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made something in my chest tighten uncomfortably. "Cancel them," he said, his voice carrying the same calm authority he used when issuing any other directive. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "Excuse me?" "Your plans tonight. Cancel them." He set down his pen with deliberate care. "I need you to accompany me to a meeting that came up unexpectedly. The Marconi situation requires delicate handling, and your presence would be valuable." I felt heat rising in my face, anger mixing with confusion. In 5 years, Alessandro had never demanded I sacrifice personal time without significant advance notice and genuine operational necessity. The Marconi situation, while requiring attention, was hardly urgent enough to justify this kind of last-minute disruption. "Mr. Moretti," I said, keeping my voice level through sheer force of will. "This isn't a work matter. I've already confirmed the dinner, and unless there's a genuine emergency that requires my immediate attention, I'd prefer to keep my commitment." Something flickered across his face too quickly to identify. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and when he spoke again, his tone had cooled several degrees. "I see," he said, the 2 words carrying weights I couldn't begin to measure. "Of course. Enjoy your evening." He returned to his paperwork with pointed dismissal, and I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, trying to understand what had just happened. This wasn't anger about operational convenience. This was something else, something that made my carefully maintained professional boundaries feel suddenly fragile. I gathered my materials and retreated to my own desk in the adjacent office, my hands not quite steady as I set down my tablet. Through the open door, I could see Alessandro's profile, his concentration seemingly absolute on whatever document he was reviewing. But I knew him too well to mistake the performance for reality. The tension in his shoulders, the slightly too controlled precision of his movements, these were tells I'd learned to read over years of observation. The afternoon crawled past with excruciating slowness. Alessandro called me in twice for routine matters, his manner absolutely professional, giving no indication of the earlier tension. If anything, he was more formally courteous than usual, addressing me as Miss Laurent instead of Helena, maintaining careful physical distance when reviewing documents together. It felt like punishment, this sudden withdrawal of the informal ease we'd developed. And the fact that I felt punished made me angry, because I'd done nothing wrong by having a personal life outside his orbit. At 5:30, I began organizing my desk for the weekend. Alessandro appeared in my doorway, his suit jacket already on, briefcase in hand. "Have a pleasant evening, Miss Laurent," he said formally. "I'll see you Monday morning." "Mr. Moretti," I acknowledged, matching his tone. He left without another word, and I sat in the sudden silence of the empty office, feeling unbalanced in ways I couldn't fully articulate. I went home, showered, and dressed for dinner with more care than I'd originally planned. The burgundy dress I chose hugged my curves without being inappropriate, paired with simple gold jewelry and heels that made my legs look longer. I told myself I was dressing for myself, for David, for the elegant restaurant we'd be dining at. I refused to examine the small voice suggesting I was dressing to prove something to a man who wouldn't even know what I was wearing. David arrived precisely at 7, looking handsome in a well-cut suit, his smile warm and genuine as he helped me into his car. He was kind, funny, intellectually engaging in ways that reminded me why we'd been friends years ago. On paper, he was exactly the kind of man I should be interested in. But as we drove through the city toward the restaurant, I found myself mentally cataloging the differences between David's easy charm and Alessandro's concentrated intensity. David laughed easily, filled conversational silences with anecdotes and observations. Alessandro used silence as a tool, let it stretch until it revealed truths people didn't mean to expose. "You seem distracted," David observed gently as we waited for the light to change. "Everything okay?" "Just work," I lied smoothly. "Long week." "Tell me about it," he commiserated. "Though I imagine your weeks are considerably more interesting than mine. You still can't tell me exactly what your boss does, can you?" I smiled, deflecting with practiced ease. "Import, export, various business holdings. Very boring, actually." He laughed, not believing me but gracious enough not to press. "Right. And I'm sure all import-export executives need assistants who can read contracts in 4 languages and spot financial irregularities at a glance." The restaurant was everything David had promised elegant without being pretentious, the kind of place where conversations could happen without shouting over ambient noise. We were seated at a corner table with good sightlines, a positioning I noted automatically before catching myself. 5 years of working for Alessandro had trained me to assess rooms for security vulnerabilities, identify exits, note potential threats. I forced myself to relax, to be present for the date I was actually on, rather than the ghost of professional habits. David ordered wine, and we fell into conversation about mutual acquaintances from our journalism days, the directions our careers had taken, the ways the city had changed. He was attentive, asking questions that showed genuine interest in my responses, laughing at my occasional dry observations. It should have been perfect. It was perfect, objectively. But halfway through the main course, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it reflexively, saw Alessandro's name, and felt my pulse spike inexplicably. The Marconi meeting was postponed. Your evening remains your own, after all. I stared at the words, trying to parse the meaning beneath them. Was this an apology? An acknowledgement that he'd been unreasonable? Or simply a factual update? "Work?" David asked, noticing my attention on the phone. "Just an update on something for Monday," I replied, setting the device aside. Nothing urgent. But the message had broken something, pulled me out of the pleasant fiction that I could separate my professional existence from whatever this dinner represented. I found myself wondering if Alessandro had actually had a meeting scheduled, or if he'd manufactured the conflict as some kind of test I'd failed by refusing to cancel. The thought was paranoid, ridiculous. Alessandro Moretti had an empire to run, genuine crises that demanded his attention. My personal dinner plans were insignificant in the scope of his concerns, except his reaction had suggested otherwise. "Helena," David said gently, pulling me back to the present. "We don't have to do this if your mind is elsewhere." Guilt stabbed through me. He deserved better than divided attention, better than being the supporting character in whatever complicated dynamic existed between Alessandro and me. "I'm sorry," I said sincerely. "You're right. I've been distracted. Let me be fully present for the rest of the evening." And I tried. I engaged with the conversation, laughed at David's stories, shared some of my own carefully edited experiences. We ordered dessert, lingered over coffee, and by the time we left the restaurant, I'd almost convinced myself that the evening had been salvaged. David walked me to my door, and the moment hung between us with obvious possibility. He was attractive, intelligent, interested. Kissing him would have been easy, natural, potentially the start of something that existed entirely separate from Alessandro's gravitational pull. "I had a wonderful time," he said softly. "I'd like to do this again, if you're interested." "I'd like that," I replied, and meant it, even as part of me recognized the lie. He leaned in slowly, giving me time to retreat if I chose. His kiss was gentle, pleasant, utterly lacking in any spark that made me want more. "Good night, Helena," he murmured, pulling back with a smile that suggested he'd felt the same absence of chemistry. "Good night, David." I let myself into my apartment and leaned against the closed door, feeling the weight of the evening settle over me like a physical thing. The date had been perfectly nice. David was a good man. We could probably build something comfortable and stable if we both decided to try, but comfort and stability weren't what made my pulse race when Alessandro's name appeared on my phone screen, weren't what made me hyper-aware of his proximity when we reviewed documents together, weren't what had driven me to dress with extra care this evening, even knowing he wouldn't see the result. I changed into comfortable clothes, poured myself a glass of wine I actually drank this time, and forced myself to confront the truth I'd been avoiding for longer than I wanted to admit. Somewhere in the past 5 years, my professional respect for Alessandro Moretti had transformed into something more dangerous, more complicated. I'd convinced myself it was admiration for his intelligence, appreciation for how he valued my contributions, the satisfaction of being essential to someone who accepted nothing less than excellence. But his reaction to my dinner plans had revealed what I'd been refusing to see. He felt something beyond professional regard as well. And that knowledge changed everything, made the careful boundaries we'd maintained feel like walls built against an inevitable flood. I sat in my quiet apartment, wineglass cradled in my hands, and wondered what would happen when those walls finally broke. Monday morning arrived with unexpected weight. I dressed with my usual care, armor of professionalism carefully assembled, but found myself hesitating before leaving the apartment. The weekend had provided too much time to think, to examine the careful distance I'd maintained from truths I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Alessandro's text Friday night had haunted me through Saturday and Sunday. Not the words themselves, which were innocuous enough, but the timing, the subtext I couldn't quite dismiss as imagination. I arrived at the office 15 minutes early, a habit ingrained from years of ensuring Alessandro's day began smoothly. Carla was just leaving from the night shift, and she offered me her usual tired smile. "He came in yesterday," she mentioned casually. "Sunday afternoon, stayed until almost midnight." I absorbed this information with practiced neutrality, though concern flickered through me. Alessandro worked brutal hours, but Sundays were typically sacrosanct, reserved for family obligations or the rare moments of genuine rest his lifestyle permitted. "Did he mention what was urgent?" I asked, keeping my tone professionally curious. Carla shrugged. "Just said he had things to review. Though between you and me, he seemed more brooding than usual. Didn't even acknowledge Marco when he brought dinner up." I thanked her and moved to my desk, booting up my computer and reviewing the week's schedule. At precisely 8:30, I heard Alessandro's private elevator arrive. His footsteps crossed the reception area, steady and unhurried. "Good morning, Mr. Moretti," I greeted him, rising from my desk as he passed. "Helena," he acknowledged, barely pausing. "My office in 10 minutes. Bring the Marconi files and the updated financial projections." His tone was clipped, purely business. I gathered the requested materials and carried them to his office exactly 10 minutes later, finding him already immersed in paperwork. "The Marconi situation," he said without preamble, not looking up. "Walk me through your assessment of their current leverage position." I launched into the analysis I'd prepared over the weekend, laying out the various factors that affected our negotiating strength. Alessandro listened with absolute focus, occasionally interrupting with sharp questions that tested the depth of my preparation. This was familiar territory, the professional dynamic where we both excelled. But something felt different today, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before, a careful avoidance of eye contact that suggested deliberate choice rather than distraction. "Your recommendation?" he finally asked, after I'd finished my presentation. "Push for better terms on the distribution arrangement," I said confidently. "They need our network more than we need their product. But maintain the relationship. They're reliably competent, and that has value beyond immediate profit margins." Alessandro nodded slowly, making notes on the pad in front of him. Set up a meeting for Thursday. I'll handle it directly. I added it to my tablet's calendar, noting the time and location he specified. As I moved to leave, his voice stopped me. How was your dinner Friday? The question landed between us like a stone dropped into still water. I turned back slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time since entering his office. It was pleasant, I replied carefully. The restaurant was excellent. Pleasant, he repeated, something unreadable in his expression. And will there be more pleasant dinners with Mr. Rosen? The directness caught me off guard. Alessandro rarely asked personal questions, and when he did, they were usually veiled in professional concern about my availability or discretion. I'm not sure that's relevant to our work here, I said, keeping my voice level despite the way my heart had begun racing. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made me want to look away. You're right. It isn't. But he didn't look away, and neither did I. The silence stretched between us, charged with things neither of us seemed willing to name. Is there anything else you need from me this morning? I finally asked, breaking the moment because someone had to. No, he said quietly. That will be all. I returned to my desk, my hands trembling slightly as I set down the tablet. Through the open door, I could see Alessandro's profile, his attention apparently back on his paperwork. But I knew better. I'd learned to read the subtle signs of his attention, even when it appeared elsewhere. The morning progressed with routine efficiency calls to attorneys, coordination with various department heads, the endless administrative details that kept Alessandro's empire functioning smoothly. He called me into his office twice for legitimate business matters, and both times maintained absolute professional distance. It should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like punishment. At noon, Marco appeared, which was unusual. Alessandro's head of security rarely came to the office during business hours, unless summoned for specific strategic discussions. He wants to see you, Marco said simply, jerking his head toward Alessandro's office. I found Alessandro standing at the windows, looking out over the city with his back to the door. His posture was rigid, hands clasped behind him in a way that suggested controlled tension. Close the door, he said without turning. I complied, remaining near the entrance, suddenly aware of how alone we were. The office felt smaller than usual, the air thick with unspoken things. 5 years, Alessandro said quietly, still not facing me. You've worked for me for 5 years, Helena. Yes, I agreed, unsure where this was leading. In that time, you've never asked for special treatment, never complained about the hours, the pressure, the nature of what we do here. He turned then, his dark eyes finding mine across the space. You've been absolutely professional, maintained boundaries that most people in your position would have blurred long ago. I waited, knowing there was more coming. So, when I tried to interfere with your personal plans Friday, he continued, it was inappropriate, an overreach of my position as your employer. It was, I agreed softly. Something flickered across his face. Might have been surprise at my direct acknowledgement. And yet you handled it with the same grace you handle everything else. You set a boundary, firmly but without drama, and left me to examine my own motivations. What did you find? I asked, the question escaping before I could think better of it. Alessandro moved toward me slowly, each step deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could smell his cologne, see the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. That I don't like the idea of you having dinner with other men, he said bluntly. That the thought of someone else making you smile, making you laugh, disturbs me in ways that have nothing to do with professional concern. My breath caught in my throat. I'd suspected, but hearing it stated so plainly stripped away the comfortable ambiguity we'd both been hiding behind. "Mr. Moretti," I began. "Alessandro," he interrupted. "After 5 years, after what I'm about to say, I think we can dispense with the formality." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I've spent the weekend trying to convince myself this is a phase," he continued. "A temporary distraction that will pass if I ignore it sufficiently. But I've built my success on acknowledging reality rather than hiding from it. And the reality is that somewhere in these 5 years, you became essential to me in ways that have nothing to do with your professional capabilities." "This is complicated," I managed to say, my mind racing through implications and consequences. "Everything worthwhile is complicated," Alessandro replied. "But I'm not asking for anything right now, Helena. I'm simply acknowledging what exists between us, what's been building whether we've chosen to recognize it or not." I wanted to deny it, to protect the careful professional distance that had kept everything safely compartmentalized. But I'd never lied to him about important things, and I wasn't going to start now. "I know," I said quietly. "I've known for a while, I think. I just wasn't ready to admit it." Relief flashed across his face, quickly controlled. "And now? Are you ready?" "I don't know what ready looks like," I admitted. "You're my employer. Your world is dangerous in ways most people can't imagine. Getting involved with you personally would be complicated at best, disastrous at worst." "All true," he acknowledged. "But you're not most people, Helena. You already understand my world better than anyone outside my immediate family. You've seen the violence, the moral compromises, the constant calculation required to maintain power. And you've stayed. I stayed because I'm good at my job," I countered. "Because you pay me very well and treat me with respect. That's not the same as choosing to be personally involved with someone whose enemies would see me as a vulnerability to exploit." Alessandro's expression hardened slightly. "Anyone who attempted to harm you would discover very quickly why I've maintained my position for 20 years. You're already protected, Helena, whether we acknowledge this thing between us or not. The only question is whether we continue pretending it doesn't exist." I thought about David's pleasant kiss, the comfortable possibility of a normal relationship with someone whose biggest crisis was a delayed article deadline. Then I thought about the way my pulse raced when Alessandro's hand accidentally brushed mine, the hyper-awareness of his presence that made me notice when his attention shifted in a crowded room. "I need time," I finally said, "to think about this clearly, without the pressure of proximity." He nodded slowly. "How much time?" "I don't know. Weeks, maybe. This isn't a small decision, Alessandro." "I'm aware," he said dryly. "Take the time you need. But know this. I'm a patient man when the outcome matters to me. And this matters more than I'm comfortable admitting." The honesty in his voice made something in my chest ache. Alessandro Moretti, who maintained absolute control over every aspect of his empire, was offering me vulnerability disguised as patience. "I should get back to work," I said, needing distance to process what had just happened. "Of course." He stepped aside, giving me clear passage to the door. "Helena?" I paused, looking back. "Thank you for not dismissing this outright," he said quietly, "for taking it seriously enough to consider." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and retreated to my desk. Through the open door, I watched him return to his windows, his silhouette dark against the city beyond. Everything had changed with that conversation, and yet nothing had changed. I still had work to complete, calls to make, problems to solve. But now there was this new knowledge sitting between us, acknowledged and waiting, impossible to ignore. I pulled up the Marconi files and forced myself to focus on distribution percentages and territory negotiations. But part of my mind kept circling back to Alessandro's words, to the careful restraint in his admission, to the way he'd given me space while making his position devastatingly clear. The rest of the day passed in a blur of maintained professionalism, masking emotional turbulence. Alessandro called me in twice more for legitimate business matters, and both times we maintained the careful distance of employer and employee. But something had shifted, become visible in the way his gaze lingered half a second longer, in the careful way he ensured our hands didn't touch when passing documents. At 6 o'clock, I began organizing my desk for the evening. Alessandro appeared in my doorway, jacket already on. "I have a dinner meeting with the Santoro family," he said. "But I wanted to remind you that the wedding invitation still stands. Next month, as we discussed." "I remember," I replied. "It's on my calendar." He nodded, hesitated as if wanting to say something more, then simply offered, "Good night, Helena." "Good night, Alessandro." I watched him leave, then sat alone in the quiet office, trying to understand how 5 years of careful professionalism had unraveled in a single conversation. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Dinner was great, even if the chemistry wasn't quite there. Hope we can still be friends?" I smiled despite myself at his diplomatic phrasing. "Absolutely. Coffee sometime soon?" His reply came quickly. "Perfect. You deserve someone who makes you feel more than pleasant, Helena." I stared at the words, thinking about Alessandro's intensity, the way his presence made every nerve ending feel heightened. Pleasant wasn't the right word for what I felt around him. Alive, terrified, exhilarated, those were closer. I gathered my things and headed home, but sleep eluded me that night. Instead, I lay awake, weighing impossible choices and trying to calculate risks in a situation where the variables kept shifting. By morning, I still had no answers, but I had begun to suspect that some decisions couldn't be made through pure analysis, that eventually I would have to trust something beyond careful calculation. The question was whether I was brave enough to take that leap. The weeks that followed settled into a peculiar rhythm where everything appeared normal on the surface, while fundamental shifts occurred beneath. Alessandro gave me space as promised, but his patience wasn't passive. It was active, deliberate, a demonstration through consistent action rather than pressure. He began arriving earlier, ensuring fresh coffee was waiting at my desk in the exact preparation I preferred. Not asking his assistant to arrange it, doing it himself, the small gesture carrying more weight because of who he was, a man whose time was measured in millions, taking 30 seconds each morning to ensure mine started well. He scheduled meetings around my preferences without being asked, remembered which clients made me tense and buffered those interactions with easier assignments afterward. When I mentioned in passing that I'd been meaning to visit a new art exhibit, tickets appeared on my desk the next morning with a simple note. "Thought you might enjoy these." These weren't grand romantic gestures meant to sweep me off my feet. They were quiet demonstrations of attention, proof that he'd been listening to throwaway comments, noticing details I hadn't realized I'd revealed. "You're being very patient," I observed one afternoon, 3 weeks after our conversation in his office. We were reviewing quarterly projections, seated across from each other at his conference table. Alessandro looked up from the spreadsheet, his expression neutral. "I told you I would be. Most men in your position would simply demand what they wanted and expect compliance. Most men in my position surround themselves with people who tell them what they want to hear," he replied. "You've never done that, Helena. It's one of the reasons you're valuable to me." I studied him across the table. This man who commanded absolute authority in every other aspect of his life, but was willing to wait for something he couldn't control. What happens if I decide this isn't something I can pursue? Something flickered in his dark eyes, might have been pain, quickly controlled. "Then we continue as we have been. You're too good at your job for me to lose you over personal feelings that can't be reciprocated." "That's very rational," I said softly. "One of us should be," he replied with a hint of dry humor. "Since I've discovered rationality becomes difficult where you're concerned." The admission, casual and devastating, made my breath catch. I'd seen Alessandro navigate complex negotiations with absolute composure, face genuine threats with calm calculation. Hearing him confess to losing that control because of me rewrote my understanding of power dynamics between us. The Santoro wedding arrived on a Saturday evening in late October. I'd debated what to wear for longer than I wanted to admit, finally settling on a deep emerald gown that was elegant without being ostentatious. The neckline was modest, the fabric expensive but understated. The overall effect sophisticated rather than seductive. Alessandro arrived at my apartment precisely at 6, and the look in his eyes when I opened the door made every minute of agonized wardrobe deliberation worthwhile. "You look stunning," he said simply, the compliment carrying more weight because he didn't usually offer them. "Thank you," I replied, allowing him to help me with my wrap. "You clean up reasonably well yourself." It was an understatement. Alessandro in a tuxedo was devastating, all sharp lines and controlled power, the formal attire emphasizing rather than softening his inherent authority. The ride to the venue passed in comfortable conversation about neutral topics, the careful distance we'd maintained at work, extending into this personal context. But I was aware of his proximity in ways I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. The subtle scent of his cologne, the way his hand rested near mine on the seat between us. The wedding was exactly what I'd expected. Opulent display of wealth and tradition, families who'd built empires through means they'd never discuss publicly celebrating the union of their children. I recognized several faces from Alessandro's business dealings, nodded politely at people I'd coordinated meetings with but had never met in person. Alessandro's hand settled at the small of my back as we entered, a possessive gesture that didn't go unnoticed. I felt eyes tracking us, calculations being made about what my presence at his side meant. "They're speculating," I murmured as we moved through the crowd. "Let them," Alessandro replied calmly. "You're here with me. That's all the information they need." We were seated at a prominent table, close enough to the family to signal status, but not so close as to suggest intimate connection. Throughout the ceremony, Alessandro remained attentive without being overly familiar, his focus split between the proceedings and my comfort. During the reception, as music filled the ornate ballroom and couples took to the dance floor, he turned to me with a slight smile. "I believe this is traditionally when I ask you to dance." I accepted his offered hand, allowing him to lead me onto the floor. His palm settled at my waist, firm, but not presumptuous, maintaining appropriate distance, even as we moved together in time with the music. "You're a better dancer than I expected," I observed. "My mother insisted on lessons when I was young," he replied. "She believed that power required refinement, that brutality should always be wrapped in civilization. She sounds formidable." "She was," Alessandro said quietly, something vulnerable passing across his features. "She died when I was 23. Sometimes I wonder what she would think of the choices I've made." It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother beyond passing reference, the first crack in the careful control he maintained over personal revelations. "I think," I said carefully, "that she would see a man who's built something significant, who operates by a code even when it costs him, who values loyalty and protects those under his authority. Those aren't small things, Alessandro." His hand tightened slightly at my waist. "You have a gift for seeing possibilities rather than limitations. I have a gift for accurate assessment," I corrected. "It's why you hired me." The song shifted to something slower, more intimate. Alessandro pulled me incrementally closer, still maintaining propriety, but reducing the careful distance we'd preserved. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice pitched for my ears alone. "About why I reacted the way I did when you had dinner plans with David." I waited, my heart rate increasing despite my attempt at composure. "I've spent 20 years building this empire," Alessandro continued. "I've made difficult choices, eliminated threats, done things I'm not proud of but were necessary for survival and success. Throughout all of it, I've maintained absolute control over my emotions, because showing weakness in this world is suicide. His dark eyes found mine, holding my gaze with uncomfortable intensity. And then you walked into my office 5 years ago, and gradually, without either of us acknowledging it, you became the one variable I couldn't control. You made yourself essential in ways that go far beyond professional competence. And when I realized you might choose to build something with another man, someone who could offer you normalcy and safety, it terrified me in ways genuine threats never have. I absorbed this confession, feeling the weight of it settle between us. Alessandro, I'm not asking for an answer tonight, he interrupted gently. I'm simply explaining why patience doesn't come naturally to me where you're concerned, and why I'm willing to practice it anyway. The song ended, but we remained on the dance floor for a heartbeat longer than necessary before he stepped back, offering his arm to escort me back to our table. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and careful observation. I watched Alessandro navigate complex social dynamics with the same strategic precision he applied to business negotiations, noted how people deferred to him with a mixture of respect and fear. But I also noticed the moments when his attention would drift to me, checking without being obvious that I was comfortable, engaged, not overwhelmed by the intensity of his world. At midnight, as the celebration showed no signs of winding down, Alessandro leaned close. I think we've made sufficient appearance. Shall we leave? I nodded gratefully, and he guided me through the crowd with practiced efficiency, accepting congratulations and well wishes with appropriate brevity. The ride back to my apartment passed in contemplative silence. When we arrived, Alessandro helped me out of the car but made no move to follow me to my door. Thank you for accompanying me tonight, he said formally. Your presence was appreciated. I looked at him in the dim light of the street lamp. This complicated man who was offering me something precious disguised as professional courtesy. Alessandro, I said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Would you like to come up for coffee? Something shifted in his expression, hope and caution fighting for dominance. Are you certain? No, I admitted honestly. But I'm tired of making every decision based on certainty. Sometimes you have to act on possibility. A slow smile crossed his features, transforming his face in ways I rarely witnessed. Your own words being used against you. Is that a yes or no? I asked, trying to maintain some semblance of composure despite my racing heart. It's a yes, Alessandro replied quietly. It's always been yes where you're concerned, Helena. We rode the elevator to my floor in charged silence, my hand trembling slightly as I unlocked my door. Alessandro followed me inside, his presence making my modest apartment feel suddenly smaller, more intimate. Coffee? I offered, needing the familiar ritual to ground myself. Please. I moved through the mechanical motions of preparation, hyper-aware of him standing near my bookshelf, examining the titles I'd collected. You have excellent taste, he observed, pulling out a worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. I've always had a weakness for stories about patience and strategic revenge, I replied, bringing 2 cups to the small living room. Alessandro settled onto my couch, accepting the coffee with a slight smile. Appropriate, given your current employer. I didn't make the connection when I first took the job, I admitted, sitting beside him. I just needed to pay rent and prove my journalism degree wasn't completely worthless. And now? He asked. 5 years later, what do you need? I considered the question seriously, looking at this man who'd somehow become the center of my existence without either of us acknowledging it. I need to know that this is real, I said finally. That it's not just proximity and intensity creating something that wouldn't exist otherwise. I need to know that you see me as more than an exceptional assistant who happens to be female. Alessandro set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. Helena, I've had multiple exceptional assistants over the years. I've worked alongside brilliant, attractive women in various capacities. None of them kept me awake at night wondering what they were thinking. None of them made me second-guess tactical decisions because I was concerned about their opinion. He shifted slightly closer, his hand moving to rest near mine on the couch cushion between us. None of them made me feel like I'd been punched in the chest when they smiled at another man. He continued quietly. This isn't about competence or convenience. This is about you specifically, the way your mind works, the grace with which you navigate impossible situations, the strength that lets you stand up to me when necessary. This is complicated, I whispered. I know. Your world is dangerous. I know that too. I could be putting everything at risk, my safety, my career, the careful life I've built. Yes, Alessandro agreed. But you could also be choosing something extraordinary, something that doesn't fit conventional parameters but exists nonetheless. I looked at our hands, nearly touching but not quite, the space between them charged with possibility. I'm scared, I admitted. So am I, he replied, the confession stark and honest. Terrified, actually, of losing you, of not being enough, of my world destroying something precious before I've fully appreciated what I have. And the vulnerability in his voice decided me. I closed the small distance between our hands, lacing my fingers through his. Alessandro's breath caught, his dark eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made every nerve ending feel heightened. I can't promise this will work, I said softly. I can't promise I won't panic and retreat. But I'm willing to try, to see what this could become if we're both brave enough. That's all I'm asking, Alessandro replied, his thumb tracing slow circles against my palm. A chance to prove that what I feel isn't temporary, that this matters enough to navigate the complications together. He leaned forward slowly, giving me time to pull away, his free hand coming up to cup my face with surprising gentleness. May I kiss you? He asked, the question both formal and devastating. Instead of answering verbally, I closed the remaining distance between us. The kiss was nothing like David's pleasant, forgettable touch. This was fire and intensity, years of unacknowledged tension finally finding release. Alessandro's hand tightened in my hair, his other arm pulling me closer as I responded with equal fervor. When we finally broke apart, both breathing harder, he rested his forehead against mine. I've been imagining that for far longer than I'm comfortable admitting, he murmured. It was worth the wait, I replied, surprised by my own boldness. Alessandro smiled, genuine and unguarded in ways I'd never seen. The waiting isn't over, Helena. This is just the beginning. We stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, hands intertwined, acknowledging what we'd started while understanding the complications that lay ahead. Eventually, Alessandro pulled back slightly. I should go, let you process what we've begun here. Always so controlled, I observed. With you, yes, he agreed. Because rushing this, pushing for more than you're ready to give, would be the fastest way to lose you. And I have no intention of losing you, now that I finally have permission to try. He stood, helping me to my feet, and we walked to the door together. At the threshold, he turned back, his expression serious. Whatever happens from here, whatever we build or don't build, know that you've changed something fundamental in me, Helena. You've made me want things beyond power and empire, made me imagine possibilities I'd convinced myself weren't available to men like me. Alessandro, I began, overwhelmed by the honesty. No response necessary, he interrupted gently. Just something for you to think about as we figure out what this becomes. He kissed my forehead, a gesture tender and protective, then left before I could formulate coherent words. I closed the door and leaned against it, my fingers moving to touch my lips where his had been. Everything had changed tonight. Boundaries crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Truths acknowledged that would fundamentally alter our dynamic. Tomorrow I would return to being his assistant, navigating the professional requirements of my position. But underneath that familiar structure, something new was building, something that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I moved to my window, looking out at the city lights, and wondered what Alessandro's view looked like from his penthouse, whether he was standing at his own window thinking similar thoughts. The answer came in a text message moments later. "Good night, Helena. Sleep well knowing you've made me happier tonight than I can remember being in years." I smiled despite myself, typing a response. "Good night, Alessandro. Try not to let this newfound happiness make you soft in your business dealings." His reply was immediate. "Never. That's why I have you, to remind me when sentiment threatens strategic thinking." I set my phone aside and prepared for bed, but sleep came slowly, my mind replaying the evening's revelations and acknowledging that whatever happened next, there was no returning to the careful distance we'd maintained before. We'd crossed a line tonight. Now we would discover whether what waited on the other side was worth the risks we were both taking. The dynamics shifted in ways both subtle and profound. To outside observers, nothing had changed. Alessandro remained the controlled, strategic leader of his empire, and I continued as his exceptionally capable assistant. But between us, in the spaces nobody else could see, something new was building. He began finding reasons to work late when I worked late. His presence in the adjacent office a comfortable accompaniment, rather than pressure. We'd order dinner and review files together, and sometimes the conversation would drift from business to personal, revealing pieces of ourselves we'd carefully protected before. I learned that Alessandro had wanted to be an architect in his youth, before his father's death thrust him into a world where such dreams became impossible luxuries. That he collected first editions of poetry despite his reputation for ruthless pragmatism. That he'd been engaged once, in his 20s, to a woman whose family had considered the match advantageous until they discovered the true nature of his business. He learned that I'd chosen journalism hoping to expose corruption, only to discover that truth was a commodity people valued less than I'd naively believed. That my parents had died in a car accident when I was 22, leaving me with student debt and no safety net. That working for him had initially felt like moral compromise, but had evolved into something more complex as I understood the codes he operated by. "You could have been anything," Alessandro observed one evening, weeks after the Santoro wedding. We were in his office, reviewing contracts while rain streaked the windows. "Why waste your intelligence on a criminal's empire?" "You're not a criminal," I replied automatically, then caught myself. Or rather, you're more than that reductive label. He looked up from the document he was reviewing, something vulnerable in his expression. "Most people can't see beyond the surface." "Most people haven't spent 5 years observing how you operate," I countered. "Yes, you exist outside legal boundaries. Yes, you've done things that would horrify civilians. But you also maintain codes that many supposedly legitimate businessmen ignore. You protect your people, keep your word, refuse to harm innocents." "Those are low bars for morality," Alessandro said dryly. "Perhaps," I acknowledged, "but they're bars that many fail to clear regardless. I'm not justifying what you do, Alessandro. I'm simply saying that understanding complexity doesn't require approval." He studied me for a long moment. "This is why I knew you were different. You see ingredients rather than absolutes. Life taught me that absolutes are luxuries people without hard choices can afford." The rain intensified against the windows, creating a cocoon of sound around us. Alessandro stood and moved to the bar, pouring 2 glasses of wine without asking if I wanted one. "I need to tell you something," he said, handing me a glass. "About the Bratva situation." I straightened, immediately alert. The Russian organization had been making territorial moves that concerned several of Alessandro's business interests. "How serious is it?" I asked. "Serious enough that I've increased security protocols. Your apartment is now monitored, discreetly. Marcus follows at a distance when you're out. The routes you take to and from work are varied to prevent pattern establishment. I absorbed this information, trying to decide how I felt about the invasion of privacy disguised as protection. You could have asked before implementing those measures, I said carefully. I could have, Alessandro agreed. But you would have argued it was excessive, that you could take care of yourself. And you'd be partially right. You're more capable than most people. But the Bratva doesn't care about capability when they want leverage. Fear flickered through me, quickly controlled. They know about me? About us? They know you're important to me, he confirmed. Whether that's professional or personal makes no difference to them. A vulnerability is a vulnerability. I took a sip of wine, processing implications. So I'm a liability now. Alessandro crossed to where I sat, kneeling beside my chair so we were at eye level. You're not a liability, Helena. You're something precious. I have no intention of allowing anyone to harm. There's a significant difference. His hand covered mine on the armrest, warm and solid. I told you my world was dangerous, he continued quietly. That choosing this thing between us came with risks. I won't apologize for taking measures to minimize those risks, but I will apologize for not consulting you first. That was a violation of your autonomy, and I'm sorry. The apology, genuine and unforced, meant more than the protection itself. Alessandro Moretti didn't apologize often, didn't admit fault easily. Thank you, I said softly, for the honesty and the apology. I understand the necessity, even if I don't love being monitored without my knowledge. Would it help if you knew who was watching? He asked. Marcus can introduce himself properly, explain the protocols, make you feel less like prey and more like a protected asset. I smiled despite the seriousness of the conversation. Protected asset. How romantic. I've never claimed to be romantic, Alessandro replied, but his eyes held warmth. Strategic, yes. Protective, absolutely. But romance requires a lightness I'm not certain I possess. You brought me coffee every morning for 6 weeks, I pointed out. You remember which classical composer I prefer when I'm stressed. You've read every book I've recommended and left thoughtful notes about your perspectives. Those are just paying attention, he argued. Exactly, I said, cupping his face with my free hand. Romance isn't grand gestures, Alessandro. It's sustained attention, consistent care, choosing someone's comfort over your own convenience. You've been romancing me for months without realizing it. Something shifted in his expression. Pleasure and surprise mixing equally. He turned his head slightly, pressing a kiss to my palm. Then I'll continue doing so, he murmured. Unintentionally or otherwise. The moment stretched between us, charged and intimate. Then Alessandro's phone buzzed with the specific tone that indicated urgent business. He sighed, standing and moving to answer it. I watched him shift into command mode, his voice becoming cold and precise as he addressed whatever crisis had emerged. This was my reality now. Romantic moments interrupted by criminal logistics, tenderness existing alongside calculated violence. I'd chosen this with open eyes, and watching Alessandro navigate his empire with absolute authority only reinforced why I'd made that choice. He was brilliant, terrifying, capable of both ruthless pragmatism and unexpected gentleness. The complexity didn't diminish my feelings, it deepened them. When he ended the call, frustration evident in his posture, I stood and moved to him. What's wrong? I asked. Marconi is pushing boundaries again, Alessandro replied, testing whether I'm distracted by other matters. Are you? Distracted? He pulled me close, his arms wrapping around me with possessive certainty. By you? Absolutely. But not in ways that make me weak, Helena. You make me sharper, more focused, because now I have additional reasons to maintain my position. I rested my head against his chest, hearing his heartbeat steady beneath expensive fabric. "How do you want to handle Marconi?" "Directly and definitively," he replied. "I'll meet with him tomorrow. Make clear that boundaries exist for reasons." "Do you need me there?" "Yes," he said simply. "Your presence reinforces that my organization operates with intelligence and strategy. Plus, you notice things I miss when I'm focused on dominance displays." I pulled back slightly to look at him. "You know I'll call you out if you're being unnecessarily aggressive, right?" Alessandro smiled, a real expression that transformed his features. "I'm counting on it. You're one of the few people who'll tell me when I'm wrong, and I value that more than you know." We stayed like that for a while longer, holding each other while rain continued its percussion against the windows. Eventually, Alessandro reluctantly released me. "I should let you go home," he said. "It's late, and Marcus is waiting to ensure you arrive safely." "Always so protective," I observed. "Always." He agreed without apology. He walked me to the elevator, and before the doors closed, pulled me into a kiss that made my toes curl. When we broke apart, both slightly breathless, his eyes held promise. "Dinner tomorrow night?" he asked. "Somewhere quiet where we can talk without business interrupting." "I'd like that," I replied. The elevator descended, and I found Marcus waiting in the lobby exactly as Alessandro had indicated. He was a large man with kind eyes, and he nodded respectfully. "Miss Laurent, I'll be following at a comfortable distance to ensure you get home safely. You won't notice me most nights, but I wanted to introduce myself properly, as Mr. Moretti suggested." I appreciated the courtesy. "Thank you, Marcus. I understand the necessity, even if it takes some adjustment." The drive home passed quickly, and true to his word, Marcus maintained enough distance that I barely noticed his presence. Once inside my apartment, I texted Alessandro. "Home safely. Thank you for the protection and the honesty." His response came quickly. "Always, Helena. Sleep well. Dream of possibilities." I prepared for bed thinking about those possibilities, about the life we were building in the spaces between legitimate business and criminal empire. It wasn't conventional, would never be simple, but it felt authentic in ways my previous relationships had lacked. The next evening, Alessandro took me to a small Italian restaurant in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where the owner greeted him by name and led us to a private corner table. "This was my mother's favorite place," he explained, helping me with my chair. "She'd bring me here after difficult days, remind me that power without humanity becomes monstrous." "She sounds wise," I said softly. "She was," Alessandro agreed, something melancholic in his expression. "She died before she could see what I built, but I think she would have understood the choices I made, even if she didn't always approve." Throughout dinner, we talked about everything and nothing, comfortable conversations that revealed depths we'd kept carefully hidden. He told me about his father's death, the weight of inherited responsibility thrust upon him at 23. I told him about the journalism career I'd abandoned, the idealism that had gradually eroded against reality's sharp edges. "Do you regret it?" Alessandro asked. "Working for me instead of pursuing what you originally wanted?" I considered the question seriously. "I regret that the world isn't structured in ways that reward idealism, but I don't regret where I ended up. You've given me challenges, intellectual engagement, and lately something I didn't realize I was missing." "What's that?" he asked quietly. "Partnership," I replied. "Someone who sees me fully, strengths and flaws, and values both. Someone who trusts my judgment enough to let me challenge his decisions." Alessandro reached across the table, capturing my hand. "You've become essential, Helena, not just to my business but to who I am as a person. That terrifies and exhilarates me in equal measure." "I know the feeling," I admitted. We finished dinner and walked through the quiet neighborhood, his hand at the small of my back. Marcus following at his discreet distance. It felt normal and surreal simultaneously, this blending of tenderness and calculated protection. "Come home with me," Alessandro said quietly. "Not for anything beyond your comfort level, just to continue this evening somewhere private." I looked at him, this complicated man who'd somehow become the center of my gravity, and nodded. His penthouse was exactly what I'd expected. Minimalist elegance with strategic pops of color, artwork that probably cost more than most people's homes. But it also held unexpected personal touches, photographs of his family, books with worn spines suggesting frequent reading, a collection of architectural models on one shelf. "You kept them," I observed, moving to examine the miniature buildings. "Dreams don't disappear just because circumstances make them impractical," Alessandro replied, joining me. "They adapt, find new expressions." I picked up one model, a sleek modern structure with innovative use of space. "You designed this?" "Years ago, when I still allowed myself to imagine different futures." He took the model gently, setting it back in place. "Now I build empires instead of buildings. Different kind of architecture, I suppose." I turned to face him fully. "You're more than what circumstances forced you to become, Alessandro. You know that, right?" He cupped my face with both hands, his expression intense. "When I'm with you, I remember that. You make me feel like the man I might have been if choices had been different." "You're exactly the man you need to be," I countered. "Strong enough to survive this world, but still capable of gentleness. That's not weakness, Alessandro. It's extraordinary." He kissed me then, slow and deep, and I responded with everything I'd been holding back. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself fall into the moment, into him, trusting that he'd catch me. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alessandro rested his forehead against mine. "Stay with me tonight," he murmured. "Just to sleep, to wake up beside each other. I want to know what that feels like." The vulnerability in his request made my decision easy. "Okay." He showed me to his bedroom, offered me one of his shirts to sleep in, gave me space to prepare while he made a final call to ensure business was handled for the night. When I emerged from the bathroom, wearing his shirt that fell to mid-thigh, Alessandro's expression made me feel more beautiful than any elaborate dress ever had. "You're devastating," he said simply. We climbed into bed, and he pulled me against him, my back to his chest, his arm wrapped around my waist. "Thank you," he murmured against my hair, "for taking a chance on something complicated." "Thank you for being patient," I replied, "for proving that this isn't just proximity and intensity." We fell asleep like that, tangled together, and I woke briefly in the early hours to find him still holding me, his breathing deep and even. In that moment, I understood what we were building, something that existed outside conventional parameters, but felt right nonetheless. Alessandro Moretti, feared and respected in equal measure, holding me like I was something precious, worth protecting, worth cherishing. The future remained uncertain, filled with risks we were both aware of. But lying in his arms, feeling safer than I had in years despite the dangerous world surrounding us, I knew I'd made the right choice. Whatever came next, we would face it together. 3 months passed in a careful balance between professional partnership and private intimacy. We maintained strict boundaries at work, our interactions model of corporate professionalism, but evenings often found us together, either at his penthouse or my apartment, building something that felt increasingly permanent. Alessandro's patience had transformed into steady presence. He didn't push for more than I offered, didn't demand definitions or timelines. Instead, he simply showed up, consistently, proving through accumulated small actions that his feelings weren't temporary fascination, but genuine commitment. I met his sister, Isabel, over a carefully arranged lunch where she assessed me with sharp intelligence before apparently deciding I was acceptable. "You're good for him," she'd said simply. "He's been alone too long. Convinced himself he didn't need anyone beyond professional associations." The Bratva situation had escalated and then resolved through Alessandro's strategic maneuvering, a demonstration of power that involved no actual violence, but made clear that territorial encroachment would be met with devastating consequences. I'd watched him navigate those complex negotiations with admiration, seeing the brilliant mind that had built an empire from inherited chaos. But it was a Tuesday in late January when everything shifted again. I arrived at work to find Alessandro already in his office, which wasn't unusual, but his posture carried tension I'd learned to recognize as significant concern. "What's wrong?" I asked, closing the door behind me. He looked up, and something in his expression made my stomach clench. "We have a problem. Marconi has been making inquiries about you. Detailed inquiries. Your background, your family, your routines." Fear spiked through me, quickly controlled. "How detailed?" "Detailed enough that I'm concerned about his intentions." Alessandro stood, moving to the windows with the restless energy that signaled genuine worry. "He's been testing boundaries for months, pushing to see what he can get away with. This feels like escalation." "What do you think he wants?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady. Alessandro turned to face me. "Leverage. If he can't compete with me strategically, he'll look for weaknesses to exploit. You've become visible enough in my organization that targeting you would send a message. I process this information, trying to think strategically rather than emotionally." "What are my options?" "Limited," Alessandro admitted, frustration evident. "You could disappear temporarily, let me handle Marconi definitively, or you could stay, heavily protected, and we face this together." "Those aren't really options," I observed. "One is running, the other is making me a target." "Yes," he agreed quietly. "Which is why I'm giving you a third choice, Helena. Walk away entirely. Leave this job, this world, me. I have resources to ensure you're protected and comfortable elsewhere, far from anyone who might use you against me." The offer landed like a physical blow. Alessandro was giving me an out, sacrificing what we'd built for my safety. "You'd let me go?" I asked, hardly believing it. "If keeping you means putting you in constant danger, yes." His voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "I told you before that I protect what's mine. Sometimes protection means letting go." I crossed to where he stood, taking his hands in mine. "You're an idiot if you think I'm running now." Hope and fear warred in his expression. "Helena, this isn't theoretical danger. Marconi is unstable, unpredictable. I can't guarantee your safety if you stay." "You can't guarantee it if I leave either," I countered. "Men like Marconi don't forget perceived weaknesses. Running might actually make me more vulnerable, not less." Alessandro pulled me close, his arms wrapping around me with desperate strength. "I can't lose you. The thought of something happening to you because of me." "Then don't lose me," I interrupted, pulling back to meet his gaze. "Deal with Marconi the way you deal with all threats to what you've built, decisively, and let me stand beside you while you do it." "You're certain?" he asked, searching my face. "I've never been more certain of anything," I replied. "I'm not some fragile thing that needs bubble wrapping, Alessandro. I'm your partner, in business and in life. Start treating me like one." Something fierce and possessive flashed in his eyes. He kissed me hard, almost punishing, and I responded with equal intensity, proving through action that I wasn't backing down. When we broke apart, both breathing heavily, Alessandro's expression had shifted to cold determination. "All right," he said. "We do this together. But you follow security protocols absolutely. No exceptions." "Agreed." Over the following week, Alessandro moved with calculated precision. I watched him consolidate alliances, call in favors, position pieces on a chessboard I could only partially see. He worked 18-hour days, and I matched him hour for hour, my role evolving from assistant to true strategic partner. Marconi made his move on a Thursday evening. Alessandro and I were leaving a late meeting when 3 cars blocked our route, men emerging with weapons visible but not raised yet. Marcus and the security detail immediately positioned defensively, but Alessandro remained utterly calm. "Stay behind me," he murmured to me, his hand at my back both protective and possessive. Marconi himself stepped forward, a lean man in his 50s with eyes that held genuine instability. "Moretti," he said, affecting casual confidence. "We need to discuss territory arrangements." "We have nothing to discuss," Alessandro replied, his voice carrying absolute authority. "You've been testing boundaries for months. This ends tonight." "Does it?" Marconi's gaze flickered to me, calculation evident. "Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere your lovely assistant won't be caught in crossfire." I felt Alessandro's entire body tense, barely controlled violence radiating from him. "You made a critical error," Alessandro said quietly, the softness of his tone more threatening than any shout. "You assumed Helena was a weakness you could exploit. She's not. She's my strength, my partner, and harming her would unleash consequences you cannot imagine." Marconi laughed, but the sound held nervousness. "Look around you," Alessandro continued, gesturing subtly. I followed his indication and saw what Marconi hadn't yet noticed. Rooftops lined with Alessandro's people, strategic positions occupied, escape routes blocked. "This isn't a negotiation," Alessandro said. "This is me explaining reality. You leave this city tonight. You transfer your operations to territory I'm willing to cede, and you never, ever look in Helena's direction again." "And if I refuse?" Marconi challenged, but his confidence was crumbling. "Then I stop being civilized about eliminating problems," Alessandro replied, his voice utterly cold. "Your choice, Marconi. Walk away alive, or force me to demonstrate why I've maintained power for 20 years. The standoff held for endless seconds. Then Marconi's shoulders dropped in defeat. "Fine," he spat. "But this isn't over, Moretti." "Yes," Alessandro said simply. "It is." We watched Marconi retreat, his men following. Only when they disappeared did Alessandro's composure crack slightly, his hand tightening on my waist. "Are you all right?" he asked, turning to me. "I'm fine," I assured him. "That was incredibly controlled, Alessandro." "I wanted to kill him," he admitted quietly. "For looking at you, for threatening you. But you were right, decisive doesn't have to mean violent." I leaned into him, feeling the adrenaline slowly receding. "Can we go home now?" "Yes," he agreed. "Let's go home." His penthouse felt like sanctuary when we arrived. Alessandro dismissed the security detail except for perimeter guards, creating space for us to process what had happened. "I need to ask you something," he said, pouring us both drinks. "And I need complete honesty." I accepted the glass, waiting. "Can you live with this?" he asked. "With the constant risk, the dangerous men, the reality that situations like tonight will happen again because of who I am." I considered the question seriously, giving it the weight it deserved. "I'm not naive, Alessandro. I know what I signed up for, but here's what I also know. You're brilliant, protective, capable of extraordinary tenderness hidden behind necessary ruthlessness. You make me feel challenged, valued, essential. That's worth navigating complications for." Relief washed over his features. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not," I agreed with a slight smile. "But you're stuck with me anyway." He pulled me close, his forehead resting against mine. "Marry me." The words hung between us, unexpected and perfect. "What?" I breathed. "Marry me," Alessandro repeated, pulling back to meet my gaze. Not because of tonight. Not because of Marconi or danger or strategic advantage. Because you've become the most important person in my life. And I want everyone to know that you're mine and I'm yours. Tears pricked my eyes. That's the most unromantic proposal I've ever heard. I told you I'm not romantic, he replied, but his eyes held warmth. I'm strategic, protective, and deeply in love with a woman who's too intelligent to fall for flowery speeches. So I'm offering the truth instead. I need you, Helena. Choose me. I cupped his face in my hands. I already chose you. Months ago, when I decided complicated and real was better than simple and hollow. Yes, Alessandro, I'll marry you. The kiss that followed felt like coming home, like finding safe harbor after years adrift. When we finally broke apart, Alessandro retrieved a box from his desk drawer. I've been carrying this for weeks, he admitted, opening it to reveal a stunning emerald ring. Waiting for the right moment, though apparently dramatic standoffs inspire romantic gestures. He slipped the ring onto my finger. Perfect fit. And I admired how the stone caught the light. It's beautiful, I whispered. It's practical, he corrected. Emeralds are nearly as hard as diamonds, resistant to damage. Beautiful, but durable, like you. I laughed, despite myself. You really need to work on your romantic dialogue. I have a lifetime to practice, Alessandro replied, pulling me back into his arms. Starting now. We stood like that for a long while, holding each other while the city sprawled below us. The future remained uncertain, filled with risks and complications we were both aware of. But we'd chosen each other with eyes wide open, building something that existed outside conventional parameters but felt right nonetheless. Alessandro Moretti, feared and respected in equal measure, held me like I was something precious worth protecting, worth cherishing, worth risking everything for. And I held him back. This brilliant, complicated man who'd somehow become my home. Whatever came next, we would face it together, partners in every way that mattered. The empire builder and the woman who'd learned that power came in many forms, including the strength to stand beside someone in their darkness while helping them remember the light. We'd both made our choice. Now we'd build a life worthy of that choice, one complicated, beautiful day at a time.